I'm now going to deal with Romans chapter 3 and verses 1 to 20. It starts off with the question, if God treats Jew and Gentile alike, what's the point of being a Jew? Is there any advantage in being a Jew? And Paul's answer is very much so. He says the Jews, were given the very words of God. It's a bit like in modern day being brought up in a Christian home rather than in one that doesn't believe in God. It's like hitting the ground running. Paul, once he recognized Jesus was the Messiah, had an enormous wealth of scriptural knowledge, and he was able to use that as he pioneered the gospel message, often in uncharted territories. What follows in verse 3 onwards is a series of questions with short answers, but which will be answered in greater depth right up until the rest of chapter 11, right to the end of chapter 11. All these questions get answered and dealt with in greater depth. So Paul starts, what if some Jews are unfaithful to the demands of the law? Does that mean that that has nullified God's faithfulness? Does it mean that God will be unfaithful to them? And nullify is, I suppose, another way of saying neutralize, making something ineffective, like an alkali neutralizes an acid. So if some Jews are unfaithful to the demands of the law, does that then mean that that has nullified God's faithfulness? And the answer, of course, is no. But God will be true to himself, but also true to the conditions of the actual covenant and the relationship that he had. The conditions of the covenant with the Jews was not just blessing, but also judgment. God will always be true, that is, he'll always be reliable, even if everyone else is unreliable, and he will carry out his part of the agreement. Everyone else may be liars, that's the opposite of true. Everyone else may be unreliable in what they say or do. And Paul then quotes from Psalm 51 verse 4 and says, God will be proved right and justified when he speaks and will win the case when he goes to court. The question arises in verse 5, if our unrighteousness shows up God's righteousness more clearly, is God not unjust in bringing judgment on us? And verse 6 answers that. Well, certainly not, because then God could never judge the world at all. So the question comes again, if my lie, that is my being false or unreliable or unfaithful, shows up God's truth, his true character, his faithfulness, and it shows it up more clearly, it shows his glory as a result, how can my showing his glory be condemned as sin? And Paul goes on to say, in fact, not only is this a charge against us, but also why not do evil as good may come? That's what some people say about us. Now, Paul doesn't answer the question here, but he simply says their condemnation is just. He will tackle this question later on. Let me give an example. If I buy a new Ford from a dealer, and they say to me, this car needs to be run in for the first 1,000 miles. Don't go faster than 50 miles per hour or you'll damage the engine. Well, now I'm so excited about having this new car. I ignore what they've told me, and people see me driving the car fast and they say, wow, that's really a good car. What make is it? And they see the sticker on the rear window and it's telling them the dealership, and people start going to that dealer to buy cars. And after a while, my car's not running so well, and I take it back and complain. The dealer asks me, did I do what I was told in running the car for the first 1,000 miles? I say, no, but lots of people are now coming to you because of the way I drove fast around the streets. Is the dealer going to say to me, that's all right then, we'll repair the car? Or is he going to say, the damage to the car is because you didn't do what we asked you? You'll need a new engine, and the cost is going to have to be paid for by you. God warns us not to sin. The fact that my sin may show up God's character more clearly doesn't mean that we should ignore God's command and carry on committing sin. Paul then in verse 9 asks the question, are the Jews better off when it comes to the day of judgment? And the answer is no. Paul says we've already said that everyone is under sin. Everyone is a sinner, Jew included. Jews may have some advantages in having been given the law, but it doesn't mean that they are not classified as sinners. And then in verse 10 to 18, he gives several quotations from the Psalms pointing out that everyone has sinned. Verse 19 says, everyone is under the law, everyone under the law is guilty and has got nothing to say. They will be responsible for their lives and for what they've done. Verse 20, no one will be able to stand before God and say, I'm okay before God because I've kept the law, or I have the law rather, and I observe the feasts and the special days and so on. No, says Paul, the law was not given for me to say I have the law and therefore my relationship with God is good. That's equivalent to me saying I'm okay because I have a Bible. The law has been given so that we can see our sin more clearly. It actually points out sin, and it shows that no one is in a good relationship before God.